Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. This is the third and last part of foreign and defense policy. We'll be talking about Truman's foreign policy legacy. Professor Peterson, why are we focusing on Mr. Harry Truman in this lecture?
Well, you would think that this was a pretty insignificant presidency. He was not very popular when he was in office. He wasn't able to run for re-election in 1952, not because the Constitution prevented him, because the constitutional amendment that was passed during his presidency that limited the term of office of the president to 2 terms didn't apply to Harry Truman, only future presidents. But he chose not to run anyhow. He wouldn't have been reelected. So he was not very popular, but in retrospect, people think that he was a pretty significant president, especially when it came to creating an effective foreign policy making system. So when we look at the way in which our government is organized to conduct the business abroad, we always have to start with the decisions that Harry Truman made.
What were some of the key reforms that the Truman administration left behind?
Chris, there was one in each of the major elements of the foreign policy making system: the Department of State, the Department of Defense with the Joint Chiefs as being part of that, and then the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. In each one of these domains, Truman made major decisions. So now, just before we go into what exactly he did, let's take a look at this graph, because this graph shows you how the foreign policy system is organized today. You have the president in charge, of course, with the vice president standing off to one side, hoping to get into the action. There's the White House chief of staff who coordinates things. But the foreign policy decision-making system is really organized under the National Security Council with a National Security Advisor as its chair. And the people who sit on that council are the Secretary of State from the State Department, Secretary of Defense from the Defense Department, the Director of the Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and then the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or at least the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the heads of the 4 major armed forces of the United States: the Army, the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force. So when we go through Harry Truman's reforms, just keep this chart in mind, because he's the one who constructed this chart, and we'll look at all the pieces of it one by one.
Let's begin with the State Department. In what ways was this organization reformed?
The key person who did it was Dean Acheson. He was a person who was the Secretary of State under Harry Truman, and he inherited from the past an organization that was basically a patronage, a part of the patronage system of the United States government. People love to be appointed ambassadors abroad, and you could pretty much pay for an ambassadorship by contributing heavily to a political campaign. So when the United States would be negotiating with other countries in the 19th and 20th century, it would send its politicians, or even worse, its donors to political campaigns, to negotiate with sophisticated diplomats in other countries. And we often came out on the short end of the deal. So the Department of State definitely needed cleaning up.
How did Dean Acheson come in and start this cleanup process?
Well, he was a pretty sophisticated Ivy League professional, and he arrives on the scene and he says, I'm going to clean out all this patronage. I'm going to make sure that we have a foreign service, and the foreign service not only works at the lower level jobs, but they get all the top level jobs as well, except perhaps for the key posts in Europe, such as in London and Paris, Vienna, and also in Japan. Those will go to luminaries, major political figures. although I must say that was an appointment of an ambassador to Vienna, pretty nice city to live in, who was nothing other than somebody who had bundled for President Obama's campaign. So this isn't altogether a thing of the past. But by and large, in all the critical posts, in the key posts in the Middle East and in Asia and Africa, and in nearly all the critical posts, you have high-level professionals now doing the job of representing the interests of the United States. And the role of patronage has been reduced to a much lower level.
Just for information purposes, who are some of the recent leaders of the State Department?
Well, of course you know that. Former Secretary of State is Hillary Clinton. Here she is with the Chinese Prime Minister, and our current Secretary of State is none other than the former senator from the state of Massachusetts, John Kerry. Here he is with the Tunisian Foreign Minister. The Secretary of State's job is a pretty high-profile position. All of these people benefit from the reforms that Dean Acheson put into place back in the 1940s.
Let's move on to the Defense Department. The Truman administration actually created this department. So what did the U.S. have before that, and why did that cause problems?
If you look at the Constitution itself, they don't talk about a Defense Department. They talk about a Department of the Army and a Department of the Navy. So we always had the Navy and the Army for 200 years in the United States until Harry Truman came along. And in fact, when we got airplanes, the Army got its own Air Force and the Navy got its own Air Force. And trying to coordinate the Army and the Navy together was an awesome task. Even in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had his challenges making sure the Navy and the Army would work together. And that has never changed down to the present. But it was certainly helped enormously when a Department of the Defense was created. So the Department of Defense consists of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. A new department was built for the Air Force. And so the Air Force now became an independent actor, had its own place in the strategic decision-making of the government when it came to the development of our military strategy. Well, the Air Force had its interests too. So it decided that if we focus on strategic bombing, then the Air Force becomes the critical actor. So after the formation of the Air Force, the idea of strategic bombing becomes a very significant part of American military strategy. And you can see that even today with the use of drones and attacking terrorists abroad, with the use of the Air Force in the Balkans under the Clinton administration, the use of the Air Force against the Islamic State in Iraq. So the president has become very dependent upon the Air Force. Now, the Army and the Navy are not so sure that's a terrific thing. They would like to have an Air Force that's much more supportive and cooperative with them. But nonetheless, with these departments all coordinated under a Secretary of Defense, who currently is Chuck Hagel, they are forced into a more cooperative arrangement than they historically had been.
Under Truman, we also get the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What does that mean?
Well, of course, that's the military side of the operation. You've got two aspects to a Defense Department. One is the civilian side, and one is the military side. And here is Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, it is part of U.S. policy that civilians decide what is going to be done, and the military executes what the civilians decide. This is what we have in a democracy. In a democracy, we elect a civilian president. That president has civilian defense advisors. The military reports to the civilian leadership of the U.S. government. Every once in a while, you get a general who comes along who thinks that he might just be able to make better decisions than the civilian authorities. General Sherman did that in the Civil War. got his head knocked off when he tried to do that, or at least he got slapped down. And General MacArthur did that in World War II or after World War II, and he too got slapped down. So it's been a challenge from time to time to keep the generals under control, but in a democracy, the civilians are in charge. Nonetheless, of course, the professional soldiers play a major role. And to force cooperation between the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, all of the heads of these units report together to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who then reports to the president. So that too is an arrangement that Harry Truman pulled together in his administration.
Are there any more developments related to the Defense Department?
The one other thing that we should talk about is the Barry Goldwater reform that comes much later. And this was a situation where, in order to get unified action in the field, you should not only have a unification of the different military departments at the highest level, but you should have it in each theater, in each military theater, so that when you have military activity going on in a place, there should be one person in charge. And that person in charge should control the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force. Now let me give you an example of how that actually works. The Persian Gulf War is a great example of it because General Schwarzkopf was put in charge, and he was an Army general. He wasn't a Navy admiral. He didn't control the Air Force, but he does control all of these different parts of the U.S. military system in this theater for this military purpose. So the challenge here is to attack Saddam Hussein's troops, which are in Kuwait, and drive them back into Iraq. And they're all posted on the shores, waiting for an attack coming from the naval ships and the Marine Corps on those ships, who are the experts at landing, making landings from sea. And the Army, what is it going to do? It's not clear what it's going to do. The Air Force, of course, is going to do its bombing. So Schwarzkopf says, well, let's give the Army the job. So he comes up with the idea that we'll have a pretend attack, a feint, a pretend attack by sea, so that we will get the attention of all the Iraqi soldiers in that direction. And meanwhile, after we have taken out all of their radar equipment and they can't see what's going on, we'll have the Army go on a 200-mile runaround and attack from behind. So the runaround campaign, which is a brilliant idea that was developed in the 19th century in Germany, it's always interesting that Schwarzkopf, being of German descent, came up with a German strategy of encircling the enemy and attacking them from behind, and he totally crushes the opposition. So this is one of the most extraordinarily successful examples of unified command in action in the wake of the Barry Goldwater reforms that took place in the 1980s.
A third aspect of the U.S. military that was in dire need of improvement was intelligence. How bad was U.S. intelligence prior to the Truman administration?
Well, of course, the greatest tragedy is in Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. Of course, World War II had already begun. Germans, Hitler was marching across Europe, had actually taken control of France and the Scandinavian countries and Austria, and Mussolini was dominant in Italy, and so Europe was basically under fascist control. The United States was sleeping, pretending it didn't affect them. Meanwhile, Japan is invading many countries in Southeast Asia, and the United States has no idea that the Japanese have the capacity to attack our very large naval base in Hawaii. So there is no adequate security intelligence operation that is keeping track of what the capacity of the Japanese government was, or the intentions of the Japanese government. Well, it's hard to find out about people's intentions, but you can find out their capacities if you have a good intelligence operation. So these scenes that you're seeing here were needless scenes that happened because the United States had a terrible intelligence operation. So what does Harry Truman do about it? Well, Harry Truman, after the war, after World War II, creates the Central Intelligence Agency. And it has become a very critical part of our foreign policy making system ever since. And we could give several lectures on the many scandals and problems that the CIA has encountered, but you could hardly imagine the United States government operating today without a Central Intelligence Agency.
What does the foreign policy making system look like today at a glance?
Well, let's just go back to the slide we looked at before, Chris, and say the president's in charge. The president has a National Security Council with a National Security Advisor who brings together the thinking of all of these departments, state, defense, CIA, and brings the Joint Chiefs of Staff's opinions to bear on the questions. Remember, the civilians are in charge. And that's the essential features of the foreign policy making system in the United States.
To end this lecture on foreign and defense policy, Professor Peterson, I want to ask you a question. I've heard a lot about this term, the military-industrial complex. Is this something we have in the United States, and is our current deficit being driven by this thing?
Well, we could talk about that in class, Chris. But if you look at this slide, you can see that at one time we were spending as much as 14% of our gross domestic product on defense purposes. That was back in the 1950s. But that has gone down to around 3 to 4% today. So the power of the military-industrial complex has gradually ebbed if you look at the dollar and cents elements of it all. So I think really the military decisions are more informed by civilian estimates of how serious are the foreign policy problems the United States faces, rather than any hidden forces that are trying to control policy behind the scenes.
The next lecture will be on the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. But before that, we have Thanksgiving. Enjoy your breaks, and see you after that.
Happy Thanksgiving.